Hello, everyone, and welcome back to session 2 of day 3. Yes, we're in the third day of the Smithsonian Education Online Conference on climate change. We have 3 more sessions to present to you and to engage with you on in dialogue throughout the day. But remember, the conference doesn't end today. We encourage you to use the online discussion area, to visit the virtual exhibit hall, to continue sharing your research, your projects, and your interests in the global climate change issue, even after today's conference ends. But it's very nice to see a group of people who are rejoining us for our next session, which takes us under the water. We've just been on the coast. We've been talking tangentially about the potential impacts of coral reefs and mangroves, and now we're going to go underwater with Nancy Knowlton, who's going to be talking about the impacts of climate change and ocean acidification on aquatic ecosystems. And this is a large shift for us during the conference, and it represents an important topic to be part of this conversation, and you'll learn about why in just a moment. Don't forget, the reason we're doing this session live is so that we can engage you in dialogue. So please share with us your questions as we go along on the left side of the screen. There's a question box, and you can enter your questions at any time. I do want to mention that we have closed captioning being displayed for all of you on the screen. We hope you find that useful. If for whatever reason you'd like to disable that or turn that off, I'm displaying on the screen how to do that. Just click the CC button and follow the display menu to turn them off. All right. So with that, it really gives me great pleasure to introduce Nancy Knowlton, who's the Sant Chair for Marine Science at the National Museum of Natural History. And you're going to learn not only about her work, but her experience with this issue. And it gives me a great pleasure to turn it over to Nancy. Hi, Nancy.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here. Coral reefs occur all the way around the world, but I don't normally get a chance to speak to people all around the world, at least all at the same time. So thank you, those of you who are attending, and I hope to give you some insights about how climate change affects the oceans in general and coral reefs in particular. To do that, I think, before we plunge into the climate change part of it, I'd like to give you a general perspective of what's going on with the ocean overall. The ocean is a huge part of the planet. In fact, we shouldn't really call it planet Earth. We should call it planet ocean. But even though it's really big, and you'd think that people could have no impact on something so large, the reality is we're actually doing a lot of things to the ocean, which you can see on a global scale. And putting carbon dioxide into the ocean, into the atmosphere, is just one of them. Of course, that's the subject of today's and for the last 3 days discussion in the context of climate change. But I think it's important when you're thinking about the ocean to realize it's one of a number of things that people are doing to ocean. Both the chemistry of the ocean and also the organisms that live in the ocean. So in addition to carbon dioxide, or CO2, we put nutrients into the ocean. This happens through sewage or through agricultural runoff. We put poisons into the ocean, especially byproducts of manufacturing that are toxic to living things. We put dirt in the ocean just in terms of runoff when either associated with agriculture or construction near coastlines. We put lots of plastic in the ocean. I'm sure some of you have read the news stories about the giant floating garbage patch in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, but there are actually patches of plastic everywhere. And then, of course, the other thing we put into the ocean are alien species, that is, things that belong in one place but not in another place. And for example, in the Mediterranean, we have big patches of the Mediterranean being taken over by an alien invasive seagrass. And in the Caribbean right now, we are witnessing, right as I speak, a huge invasion by lionfish, which don't belong in the Caribbean. They belong only in the Western Pacific. So that's what we're putting on the input side. And on the output side, what we're taking out of the ocean is basically anything big, or more generally, anything valuable. So we've already removed about 90% of the big fishes from ocean ecosystems. In many parts of the world, people pull out big parts of the ocean in terms of the corals for construction, and also as you learned in the previous session, people are cutting mangroves from coastal habitats. So we're taking a lot of stuff out and putting a lot of stuff in, and so it's perhaps not too big a surprise that the oceans are in a crisis mode. And therefore, we're having really just an ever-growing list of disasters, and these, of course, don't just affect coral reefs. And I was curious if any of you out there have thought about or heard about some of the other things that might be happening to ocean ecosystems.
And let's hear from people. I know we have a wide variety of experience levels and in our online audience. But tell us, what are some of the things that you know about, have heard about, that are affecting coral and underwater ecosystems? Go ahead and type it into the box at the left. We've got some comments coming in already. From New York, Ken mentions acidification. Karine from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is talking about bleached coral. Hillary at Antioch is pointing out the effects of tourism and fishing. A few other comments on fisheries. Dead zones,
Yes.
decreased carbon dioxide. Yep.
Yeah, those are all really great answers. I noticed somebody mentioned the lionfish, and dead zones are a classic example of what happens when you put too much nutrients in the water. We have a giant dead zone that forms in the off the coast of where the Mississippi enters the Gulf of Mexico. That's caused by all the nutrients that flow down from the Mississippi River. So to talk about all those things would, of course, take much more than 50 minutes. So I'm going to focus today on coral reefs, but I think it's important and coral reefs and climate change, but it's important to realize that the oceans generally are stressed, and even coral reefs are dealing with a lot more than just carbon dioxide. But if you think about what carbon dioxide is doing to the ocean, it's even carbon dioxide taken all by itself has a complicated suite of impacts on the ocean. Of course, we've been talking for the last couple of days about rising temperature, but already in the comments I noticed that somebody mentioned acidification, and so there are lots of other things that are going on in the ocean associated with the rising levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide, the problem is that it essentially dissolves in seawater and it makes the ocean more acid. And in addition, rising temperatures also have effects. They cause sea level to rise, as we heard about recently with mangroves, causes the ocean to be to set up stable layers, and so there's less mixing in the ocean, and that means that deep down nutrients that are important for productive fisheries don't get to the surface to feed the food that fish need, and that reduces the productivity of the oceans. We wind up with more intense storms, as Stanley mentioned in the previous section, and also warming oceans make it much harder for many animals to resist disease. So even if you just isolate the effects of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you find out that it has many, many different complications with respect to the problems it causes in the ocean. And as we get into the climate change negotiations that are coming up in Copenhagen, and we talk about climate change issues in the United States, it's very important to keep the oceans in mind, because it's not simply just rising temperature, it's a whole bunch of other things that are happening to the oceans that we need to think about. So I'd like to begin to talk to you about coral reefs a little bit with a personal story. I'm telling you how old I am, basically, because that's a picture I took in 1975 when I was a graduate student in Discovery Bay, Jamaica. And as you can see, those reefs had lots and lots of living coral. Essentially everything you can see in the bottom, all those sticks and bushes and big heads, that's all living coral. And so the bottom was about 70 or 80% of it was living coral. Now, we knew those reefs weren't in perfect condition, and you can tell that by looking at the upper right-hand corner of that photograph, and you can see that they're a little bit farther up there. You can see there's just a few fish, and actually all those fish they're not really longer than about 5 inches or so. So the fish were very sparse and pretty small, but the corals themselves were in beautiful condition. Now, this is what happened to those reefs really over the course of about 5 years, just after I started studying them, starting in about 1980. And we went from a situation where the corals were about 70% of the bottom to less than 5% of the bottom, and they got covered with these bushy seaweeds for a combination of reasons. And so literally in my lifetime, I watched the reefs that I studied as a student vanish. And that would be a sad enough story, but it's not limited to Jamaica. This is a plot showing what's happened to corals throughout the Caribbean. And we've lost basically 80% of the living coral in the last 30 years on Caribbean reefs, which is a big number. And the Pacific, although it's somewhat less impacted than compared to the Caribbean, we've lost about 50% of the living coral in the Pacific. So even though the Pacific is a much bigger ocean, and for a long time we felt it was therefore less likely to be seriously affected by people, it's also showing huge signs of decline. And so globally, there isn't really a place where we don't have to worry about the long-term persistence of coral reefs. And so I'd sort of like, in the context of those statistics, I've told you that living coral is sort of vanishing from the face of the planet. So I'm just curious if you all have some ideas as to what percent of corals are likely to be at risk of extinction. A study was published actually just a year ago giving a number, and I'll see what kind of numbers come in, and then I'll give you the answer in just a second.
Well, let's see what people think. We are at the 33 and 75% level. No one thinks it's less than that at this point. Number looks like our majority is at 75%.
Well, actually, I managed to really scare you and depress you because the actual number is about 33%. So it's not as bad as 75%. It's 33%, but that's still 1 out of every 3 corals is at risk of extinction. And although that may seem, well, it's not 75%, that's good news. That makes them the most endangered type of animal in the world. We used to think that frogs were the most endangered animals. Some of you may have heard about the disease that's causing frogs to die off in many places around the world, but it turns out corals are actually even more endangered than frogs. So they're in very bad shape. Now, I would like to talk a little bit now about why they're in bad shape, and specifically in the context of climate change. And some of you have already mentioned in your comments this whole problem of coral bleaching. And for those of you who may have heard of it but don't exactly understand what it is, this slide sort of illustrates some of the key points. First of all, you have to remember that corals aren't just simple animals. They're actually sort of a mixture of animal and plant, or if you count the skeleton, animal, plant, and mineral. And the part of the slide on the right, all those little green balls, that's the plant part of the coral organism. It's little single-celled plants, algae, that live in the tissues of the coral. And as a consequence, you can almost think of corals rather like plants. They depend on those plant cells for food because those plant cells photosynthesize and then they pass on some of what they make from sun's energy to the coral animal itself. And so coral bleaching is a breakdown in that relationship between those plant cells and the coral animal. And it's caused by any kind of stress. It can be caused by too much light, too much darkness, too cold water, fresh water. But of course, the problem that we're worried about in the context of climate change is too much heat. And this coral bleaching can cause really massive mortality if severe. There you see a picture of the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. And as you can sort of see, sort of looking into the distance, almost everything you can see there, all those white and pink corals, have been bleached by excessive heat. Now, here's another question for the audience. We had a huge mass bleaching event in 1998 in the Indian Ocean, and I'm wondering what percentage of the corals you think might have been bleached during that event?
And Nancy, while people are voting on this question that we've put up on the screen, there was a question that came in response to the last poll, which is how many types or species are there of coral, and are the 30% that are gone, are they from a particular environment in terms of geographic latitude, longitude, or water temperature or proximity to coasts with human presence, or is that a global average?
That's a global average, and actually, there are endangered corals everywhere you look. Some of them are deep sea, some of them are shallow water. Some of them are in temperate zones. No corals live in really cold water, but some of them are sort of subtropical and some of them are tropical. So this problem of endangerment really occurs everywhere. It's particularly problematic in some parts of the Western Pacific, but I actually think when they made that estimate of 33%, I looked at the evidence for Caribbean corals, and I actually think the situation in the Caribbean is worse than they estimated. So my sense is that this is a pretty general problem, not restricted to any particular place or temperature or depth.
Well, let's see what people had to say about the question of during mass bleaching in 1998, what percent of Indian Ocean corals were bleached? The audience is pretty much neck and neck between 40 and 60, with 60 edging out. What would they be correct?
Okay, in this case, the audience was too optimistic because the actual answer to that poll is 80% bleached in 1998 and 20% died. So this clearly was a huge event in Indian Ocean coral reefs, and the problem that we have has to do with the fact that this kind of thing may happen more and more often. And in this next slide, this gives you sort of an analysis of why coral reef biologists are really worried about climate change. What you see along the bottom axis is time, ranging from the year 1000 to where we are now, about 2009. And on the vertical axis, what you see is not the absolute temperature, but the change in the temperature from the average over that long period of time. So you can see for over 1,000 years, temperatures have been pretty stable. And then to the right, you see how temperatures are moving up here. And then this is the projection up here for the future based on climate models. And this is what we call the bleaching threshold. The problem is that corals start bleaching when the temperature increases about 1 degree centigrade or about 2 degrees Fahrenheit over the normal maximum for that time of year. And so here's the bleaching threshold, and here's where we are today, and here's where we're headed. And as you can see, these projections suggest that bleaching could become an annual event by even within a few decades. And obviously, if you get 80% bleaching and 20% death every single year, you're not going to have coral reefs for very long, because these are very slow-growing organisms. They only grow about a half an inch a year. And so it's as if in the summer, those of you who live in places where there are lots of trees, that 80% of the trees suddenly lost their leaves because it was really hot, and 20% of them died. And then the people predicting climate told you, well, this is going to happen every summer. You'd be actually really worried about the trees in your backyard and everywhere else. And this is really what corals face. So
we have some people in disbelief saying, that much really. A few comments. By the way, I think you're going to cover this, but I'm going to put the question out anyway, which is, what degree rise is too much heat to a coral?
Well, that's I'll go, I think I can go back here. This degree rise, this 1 degree centigrade or 2 degree Fahrenheit over the normal temperature for the region is too much. This is where you start getting bleaching happening. So it depends on the specific place. For example, if the average temperature is, say, 28 degrees centigrade or 85 degrees Fahrenheit, then at that location, if the temperature rises to 87 degrees Fahrenheit, then you might start getting bleaching. Whereas if it's normally cooler, then bleaching will occur at a lower temperature, and if it's normally warmer, bleaching will occur at a higher temperature.
Now, Chuck asks a natural question to that, which is, can the coral adapt over that point?
Very good question. And that is, of course, the hope of those of us who study corals. It turns out that those, I'm going to go back one slide more. Oops, I have to go back past the questions here. So you can see these little zooxanthellae, or single-cell plant cells that are the part of the problem here. We used to think that was all a single species, and that's because that physically, if you put them under a microscope, they all look the same. It turns out there's a huge amount of genetic diversity among these different cells, not necessarily in this particular sample, but if you look at corals overall. And some of them are much more heat tolerant than others. Some of them can tolerate 2 or 3 degrees centigrade or twice that amount Fahrenheit, roughly, temperature increase. Others are very, very sensitive to even small increases in temperature. So the idea here is that those heat-resistant algae that live with corals become more and more common, and that these corals that we're bleaching now will ultimately be repopulated by resistant zooxanthellae, resistant plant cells, and that in the future they'll be less likely to bleach. Now, that's the theory. The reality is that we're not seeing a whole lot of evidence for that yet. And in fact, in 2005, in the Caribbean, we had the strongest heating we've ever seen. In fact, there was more heat in that one summer than in 21 previous years combined, and we had massive mortality. And we've been having bleaching in the Caribbean for about 20 years, and so even after 20 years, those corals are still not able to completely adjust. So some adjustment is definitely possible, but what may be a problem is adjusting to the levels of temperature of where we're heading. So we might be able to adjust up to here, say, or here, this is about 2 degrees above normal temperatures. But if we're getting up into this range, which is where we're likely headed if we don't do anything to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then corals are in deep trouble. So there are some other things that are going on with respect to temperature. Corals around the world are suffering from a whole swarm of diseases. Here you see pictures of different kinds of sick coral. This is called black band disease. This is called, in the center, lower center, is yellow band disease, and the lower left is white plague, and upper right is white band disease, and there's a kind of ring disease. You may be able to see just from the names of these diseases that we don't really understand much about what causes them. And unfortunately, we have no centers for disease control for the sea. So there are many more, there are almost more diseases of corals than there are coral doctors. And we really don't know much about what causes them. Although, if you look at the patterns of where disease occur, it seems as though they typically get these disease outbreaks when the water is unusually warm or with a lot of pollution, which overall makes quite a bit of sense. Now, gives you a sense of what these diseases are capable of doing. This is a before and after picture, 1988 and 1998. You see this big head of coral. You can scale that by the person there on the upper left. And remember, these corals only grow about a half an inch a year, so that's a coral that's literally hundreds of years old. Here it is on the upper left in 1988, and in 1998, entirely dead. And similarly, in the next slide, you see a similar before and after shot for branching corals. So the center big bouldery coral is fine, but look around the edges. In the upper left, there's all this branching coral around it in 1971, whereas in 1988, all that branching coral is dead. And in fact, these branching corals in the Caribbean, one of the reasons we've lost so much coral in the Caribbean is that these branching corals, we've lost about 98% of them. And they used to be so common that when I was a student, the name of this coral is Acroporus cervicornis, and I was taught about where the Acroporus cervicornis zone was. It was such a common coral that whole zones of the reef were named after it, and it's now in the last year been listed on the endangered species list. So these diseases can have huge impacts on corals, and some of them have already almost vanished as a consequence of disease. And part of the cause of that disease is the warming ocean. Now, another effect of this warm temperature, in addition to disease and bleaching, is of course the effects of hurricanes and typhoons. It may be that they may come at the same frequency, but the warmer the water is, the more likely it is that these storms will be stronger. The Category 5 storms of the Katrina era, Katrina type, are likely to be more and more typical. And you can see the red circle here, or oval, sort of covers where you find coral reefs on the planet. And what you see here is 150 years worth of tracks of hurricanes and typhoons across the planet, with the red ones being Katrina level Category 5 storms. And those Category 5 storms are just likely to become more and more common. And as you can see, apart from a very narrow zone right at the equator, most reefs are likely to be impacted by this increasing frequency of very destructive storms. And then, on top of all of this, we have this whole problem of ocean acidification, which, as I mentioned, is caused by the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere actually dissolving into the ocean. And that's good for the air in the sense that it probably reduces the warming effect, but it's really bad for the ocean because it's changing the pH, which is how acid the ocean is. And here you see a series of maps. On the upper left is what the ocean was like in 1765, with respect to its acidity, and then on the lower right where we're headed by 2100. And in this particular map, red is good and blue is bad. And by 2100, essentially you're going to have most of the world's oceans down on the lower level of suitability. So basically it'll be very hard for corals to grow at all. The problem is that when you have water that's acidic, you have a phenomenon which you can almost think of as coral osteoporosis. That is the inability of the coral to make a nice, hard, sturdy skeleton, which obviously they need to grow and to resist hurricanes and typhoons. So here you see the result of an experiment. On the upper left-hand corner, it's corals growing in normal seawater. On the upper right-hand corals, what happens when you put them in water of the type that we're likely to find by 2100, and then you put them back in normal water in the lower left, and they start regrowing their skeletons. So actually, one surprise was that the coral didn't just die outright. But the problem here is that these are almost like sea anemones. They have no skeleton at all. And so sea anemones can't build reefs. You're never going to have the Great Barrier Sea anemone off the coast of Australia. And so in the absence of skeletons, you've essentially lost all the three-dimensional structure that characterizes reefs and gives them a lot of their value, both to people and to other organisms. So this is what we're looking at with respect to scenarios for the future. Here you can see, these are of course reefs that are here today. I don't have a magic camera that can take a picture of a coral in 2100, but this is what we sort of imagine reefs that are going to be reefs that are fairly typical of a modest amount of climate change, only about 1 degree centigrade difference associated with, this is how climate scientists measure carbon dioxide in ppm, which is parts per million, so about 370 parts per million. Before we started putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it was about 280 parts per million. So you go here to the middle panel where you lose a lot of the complexity and diversity of reefs, about 2 degrees centigrade or 4 degrees Fahrenheit warmer and 450 to 500 parts per million. Still some reefs, but you've also obviously lost a lot going from the left-hand panel to the right. And here you have what things are likely to look like at greater than 500 parts per million and greater than 3 degrees centigrade or 6 degrees Fahrenheit. Essentially a wasteland when it comes to coral reefs. You really can't probably have functioning reefs in those conditions. And this is pretty worrying because business as usual, if we keep doing things the way we've been doing them with respect to putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we're likely to reach 650 parts per million by the end of the century. And that's way, way more than 500 parts per million. And even doubling the level before what's called double pre-industrial carbon dioxide level. So in other words, take what we started with before we started burning a lot of fossil fuels, double that. That's 550 parts per million. That's often considered a good target to strive for, but even that target is way, well, not way above, but somewhat above the likely conditions that will allow reefs to thrive. So when you think about that, you realize we do have a big challenge with respect to carbon dioxide and the survival of reefs.
Quick question, Nancy. There are many coming in. We're going to get to as many of them as we can. In fact, let's bring up this poll while I ask you the question. Maybe you can introduce the poll first.
So the question is, how long do you, obviously carbon dioxide is a big problem with respect to reefs, and a critical part of worrying about how serious that problem is, how long does carbon dioxide last in the atmosphere once you put it in there? So what are some of the questions that are coming in addition to the poll?
This one's interesting from Luis. So you've got coral osteoporosis, if you will, that's happening. Now, would that then be releasing more carbon into the water, and would that magnify the effect of acidification?
Actually, as it turns out, corals are kind of a wash, if you will, with respect to the carbon in the atmosphere. So for reasons that are a little too complicated to explain in this kind of context because it's a lot of chemistry and equations, but it turns out that coral reefs are kind of neutral. When you build a coral reef, it's kind of a neutral process with respect to it. It doesn't add carbon dioxide, doesn't subtract carbon dioxide. So the answers are coming in the polls, and they're more or less split between decades and centuries. I wish it were decades, but actually the correct answer is centuries. And that means the decisions we're making about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere today by choosing to respond to the issue of climate change at whatever level we choose to respond. These are decisions we're making not just for ourselves and our children and our grandchildren, but we're also making those decisions for our grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren. I mean, this is a very, very long-term commitment to levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that are being dictated by our behavior today. And so that's another reason why coral scientists actually worry quite a bit about the survival of the ecosystems they study in the context of climate change. So I guess now I'd like to sort of, having given you sort of the bare bones facts about what's going on with respect to reefs and carbon dioxide, and we say climate change, but remember it's climate change, but also ocean acidification. And I get asked this question, why should we care, quite a lot. And in fact, some people have said, well, coral reefs you can think of them as canaries in the environmental coal mine. Back in the early days of mining, miners who were worried about carbon monoxide used to bring little canaries in cages with them, and if the carbon monoxide levels got too high, the canary would pass out, and they'd say, uh-oh, we got to get out of here, and they'd run out and try to revive their canary, but they were mostly concerned about getting themselves out of a dangerous situation. And so that expression, canaries in a coal mine, is the idea is that small bits of life can be used as as a sacrifice to let us know when conditions are dangerous. So, some people have said, are coral reefs the canaries in the environmental coal mine, letting us know that things are going drastically out of kilter? And the answer I often give is yes, they are the canaries in the coal mine. And if that's the case, then the canary is actually passed out on the bottom of the cage, and we really need to do something pretty quickly if we want those canaries to revive. But it brings about the bigger question. It's one thing to sacrifice a canary. It's another thing altogether to sacrifice an entire ecosystem. And there are all sorts of both strictly financial values and also ethical values I think we need to think about when we think about the effects of climate change. That's not to say that there's any right or wrong answer, but at least we should think about what the issues are when we are doing something or not doing something about climate change in terms of the decisions we make. So
one other, I think, important perhaps analogy, tell me if you think this is appropriate, for a lot of people don't actually go into coal mines, just coal miners. And so what's going on in there people don't often know about. Similarly, most of us don't go under the water. We don't realize how serious it might be.
That's a very good, very, very good point. I mean, the biggest problem the oceans face, I think, is it's out of sight, out of mind. And I go underwater fairly regularly, and I've been doing it for 35 years, so I've actually seen these changes in my lifetime. But of course, some people don't go underwater at all, and other people are just going underwater now, and they go to, say, a reef now in the Caribbean, and they see 5% living coral and a few fish, and they think, oh, how nice, and they don't realize what we've lost. It's what some people have called the problem of shifting baselines, the fact that whatever we see when we're young we think of as normal, but the problem is that that normalness that we define by when we are young keeps shifting from generation to generation. So what those of you who say are 20 years old out there listening to me think of normal, I say, oh, you may think of that as normal, but it was completely different 35 years ago when I started studying coral reefs. And that whole problem of constantly redefining what is normal is a big issue with respect to thinking about the environment. So I mentioned value and values, and let's just start with the monetary value of coral reefs. I mean, these are widespread ecosystems that we have them in the United States, just within the 50 United States, and Hawaii and Florida have extensive reef systems, and also places in the Western Pacific like American Samoa, which we just heard about in the context of a tsunami, and Guam and another number of other places have beautiful reef systems in the U.S. And then, of course, around the world, reefs are found, and they tend to be, because they occur in warm water, they are overwhelmingly concentrated along the coastlines of developing countries. And so so the loss of coral reefs has the potential to affect both developed countries like the United States and Australia, which is the other major developed country that has a lot of reefs on its coast, and then also developing countries. But regardless of whether it's developing or developed, coral reefs do a couple of key things. They provide food to coastal peoples. They provide enormous income in many places associated with tourism. And then, of course, they also provide protection to the shoreline. And during the major tsunami that came a number of years ago, the day after Christmas, which killed huge numbers of people throughout the Indian Ocean, we really learned the importance of intact mangroves and intact coral reefs for protecting coastal populations. So I thought I would ask you a question for in Hawaii, or the same answer in Florida. Which do you think is worth more, fishing or tourism?
We'll go ahead.
See what the answer. Are there any other questions to answer?
There are several. There is a question, and I think it's important to clarify this, a reference to the coral bleaching as, is it a communicable disease? It's not, so I think it's worth clarifying that.
Yes, coral bleaching is not a communicable disease. It is, you can think of it as a disease, if you will, just the way some diseases that people have are not communicable. For example, some cancers are not communicable. It's something, but so it can't be passed from coral to coral. But the reason you find big tracts of corals all bleaching in one place is because the temperature is too hot across the entire reef, and so lots and lots of corals are affected, but they're each affected individually. And so there, I've got the answers now from that poll, and actually you guys have a pretty good assessment of the value. Tourism in many parts of the world is vastly more valuable than fishing. And often it's funny when we think about what's important to preserve, when people say, oh, the commercial fishing interest, but in fact, tourism is in Hawaii is worth about 10 times more than commercial fishing for food, and that's typical in many places. Essentially anywhere with well-developed tourism is far more valuable. And of course, the interesting thing about that is that for a reef to be valuable for tourism, you don't have to take anything out of it. You just need to bring people there and let them enjoy it and see it. And so it has the potential to be able to enjoy reefs and preserves reefs without even removing anything from them at all. So, and then I mentioned this whole issue of value versus values. And I think it's worth at least thinking about the sort of the ethical values associated with the loss of coral reefs, because they are often called the rainforests of the sea. And the reason they're called rainforests is not that there's so many coral species. I think that was a question, actually, and I may have missed answering that part of the question. There are only about 1,000 species of corals worldwide. That's not where the diversity lies. And so just as in a tropical rainforest, most of the diversity is not the trees, but all the insects and other little things crawling around. If you go to a rainforest, most of the diversity, I mean, if you go to a coral reef, most of the diversity is associated with the things that live with corals, not the corals themselves. And we estimate there's about somewhere between 1 and 9 million species on coral reefs in total. But this is really a very rough estimate. It's actually based on extrapolations from the number of insects in rainforests and also from a partial count of everything in one tropical aquarium in Baltimore. So we actually, it's not really an estimate, it's almost a guesstimate is a better way of describing it. But what we do know from looking at a few well-studied groups is that about 1/4 of everything live in the ocean lives with coral reefs. And that's a remarkable statistic when you think of the fact that coral reefs, if you squash them all together, the total area would be smaller than the state of Texas. So this 1/4 of all the ocean life in this tiny little area. And as you can see from this last slide, which I put in, that some of the things that live with coral reefs they're just spectacularly beautiful creations of nature. So when you have something like 1 to 9 million species, what are you going to do about protect them? And the thing that's really clear is something like the California condor approach is just not going to work. I went to the Grand Canyon and I remember looking up and seeing California condor number 14 flying overhead, and it was really exciting, but obviously you can't on a species by species basis protect that level of diversity. You have to actually protect the entire ecosystem.
And you're actually addressing Raymond's question about whether it's possible to transplant coral from one location.
You can actually transplant coral. It tends to be very labor intensive, and so it works on a small physical scale, but not so much on a big scale. So if, for example, you had a hotel that really wanted, and they had lost their coral, you can transplant new coral in, but it's important to remember that not only is it labor intensive, so it's sort of small scale, you have to have fixed what killed the corals to begin with. There's no point putting healthy coral into a place that is still a bad place for corals to live. And so when I talk to people, often ask me at the end of this kind of talk, make people upset and worried about coral reefs, what can you do? Well, there are two sort of ways of answering that question. On the short term and the local scale, there are actually two things that you can do to really help coral reefs survive, and that's to control fishing so that there are enough fish in the water to eat seaweeds, which otherwise overgrow corals. You saw a picture of that at the beginning of my talk when I showed you the loss of the corals in Jamaica covered with seaweed. So control fishing pressure, particularly protect the fish that eat seaweeds, and improve the water quality, again, to make it, the seaweeds tend to do really well when there's lots of nutrients in the water. And so keep the nutrients low and keep lots of seaweed-eating fish in the system. And that's really important because it builds resilience for corals. It buys them time. In the longer term, on a global scale, you've got to reduce carbon dioxide levels and somehow capture and restore this diversity, which is so at risk. So the first thing, actually, the controlling fishing and improving water quality, that's actually not hard to do. We know how to do it. That's why I say it's not rocket science. On the other hand, it is going to be a certain amount of rocket science figuring out how to deal with this carbon dioxide problem. That's a technical issue that is going to be one of the biggest challenges we face in the next couple of decades. Now we know that, I think it's really important though to emphasize the fact that local protection does help reefs resist climate change, because otherwise some of you in the audience may have already said, oh my gosh, that's just hopeless, what can we do? Let's just forget about reefs. And it's important to realize that local protection makes a difference. And you see here on the left some slides that we took on an expedition to the Northern Line Islands, which are essentially in the middle of nowhere, due south of Hawaii on the equator. And two of them are part of the Kiribati Republic and have human populations with quite a lot of fishing. And then two of them are part of these new protected areas that the United States established in the Pacific Ocean a couple of years ago. And what you can see, and so there's kind of a change from the top to the bottom. You go from no people to lots of people. And you can see in the top two pictures with no people, you have big sharks, lots of healthy coral on the right. All that brown stuff is healthy coral, and that pink stuff is something that baby corals actually like to grow on. So it's a really healthy reef over there. If you go down to the bottom where there are where there are lots of people and no protection, then you essentially have lost all the fish and you've also lost all the coral. So we know that protection really works. So the question is, how much of the world's coral reefs do you think are well protected? I don't mean just a law written in the books that's saying this is protected, but are actually physically or in some other way protected and managed well so that you have the right numbers of fish and right amounts of nutrients. How many do you think, what percentage of the world's reefs do you think are well protected?
And you can let us know that in the chat on the left side of the screen. How much of the world's reefs do you think are well protected? Let us know what you think.
Any questions coming in?
Yes. I think this is an important question about are there any rehabilitative projects with regards to reefs? Now, you mentioned you have to fix the problem that's causing the reef's issues to begin with, but are there any successful rehabilitation efforts?
There's certainly a lot of efforts going on around the world trying to figure out what the best way to rehabilitate reefs are. So that some things are the less labor intensive you can make it, the cheaper it is, and the more likely it is that you can do it on a large enough scale to be meaningful. And so there are rehabilitation efforts going on in Florida and also in Japan and the Philippines. But it's worth also something that Stanley mentioned in the previous section about mangrove forest. If you stop stressing it out, it actually will come back on its own. And in many cases, if you actually fix the problems that cause the corals to die, the corals are capable of regrowing on their own. So you use rehabilitation in very specific conditions. For example, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration often does restoration work when there's been a shipwreck, because a shipwreck grinds up the bottom sort of pulverizes the bottom and makes it very hard for baby corals to grow. And so what NOAA then does is glue down parts of the bottom to stabilize it, to make it a better place for baby corals to settle. But to do that for the size of, say, the typical, let's say an auditorium in some of your classrooms, your school auditorium, might cost several $million just to rehabilitate an area the size of your school auditorium. So it's something you do in small places when you know it's going to work. You can't do it everywhere. We gotten any answers about how much
Oh, yeah.
the world's, what do we get?
We have ranging on the top end to about 30 to 35%, and a lot of people in the 10 to 20% range, and a few much lower than that.
Okay, so here's the answer, less than 5%. And that's one of the problems. We really need to sort of up that level of protection so that many more of the coral reefs that need to be protected are. Those 3 huge protected areas that were established at the end of the Bush administration, very big steps for coral conservation. They're hugely important. And Australia has protected the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. 1/3 of the Great Barrier Reef is set aside for absolutely no removal of fishes or any kind of destructive activities. So that kind of model, about 33%, is what coral reef scientists think is about right for making sure that corals are well protected for the future. So I'd like to close with just a few beautiful pictures of reefs to inspire you to think about their long-term future, which is at least in part in your hands. This is a picture from the Northern Line Islands. You can see these spectacular places where coral reefs have lived for centuries and can still be visited by people, and where predators are abundant and fearless. This is a wonderful fish that's really common in the Northern Line Islands. You don't see it in a lot of places, but it's very common there. And where the diversity on the bottom, those are giant clams in all different colors, is really just spectacular to the mind and the eye. And these really are, coral reefs really are very, very special places. And we need to think about them when we're planning about how we use the planet. So I think it's really important to think about sort of what we need to do to prevent reef collapse, because once reefs have collapsed, as my comments have suggested vis-a-vis the expense of rehabilitating things, it's much harder. So the problem with corals and really marine ecosystems in general is, if you think of the analogy, the straw that breaks the camel's back, you've got multiple stresses going on. I emphasized that at the beginning, not only climate change and acidification, but also fishing and pollution. Often you see very quick changes. So that means you have very little warning. For example, those reefs in Jamaica that I studied as a graduate student all vanished in about 5 years. So very little warning. You can't wait till things start to look bad before you take action, because then it's too late. So often there's a kind of irreversibility to these kinds of collapses, that either they're very difficult to restore or they take literally centuries, because that's how old some of these big corals are, to get back in condition. And it's very costly to repair them. You think of that camel again on the ground with a broken back. You have to take the camel to the vet. It's a really costly procedure, fixing a wrecked up camel, and it's similarly a very costly procedure to fix a destroyed reef. And so we really need to keep those issues in mind when thinking about coral conservation. There we go. So, in fact, it's, sure, it's all right. There we go. So this is a cartoon that I sort of like to leave you with in terms of thinking about how we respond to ocean conservation issues in general and corals in specific. It's a wonderful cartoon. It says, first let's concentrate on water and then we'll worry about krill. That's, of course, what we don't want to do, because if we do it that way, our problems would be much, much bigger. And so I urge all of those of you who have been moved by this and thinking about corals and reefs and what they represent to sort of take a version of a quote from a president that I grew up with when I was younger, and ask not only what your planet can do for you, but also what you can do for your planet. And at this point, I'll take a few questions in the time that remains.
Thank you, Nancy. We do have questions. One quick one. I am struck when we look at pictures like the ones you're showing us. I mean, especially the ones that are unaffected by things like coral bleaching, how beautiful life is in these reefs and underwater. On a personal note, was it the beauty of the reefs that attracted you to the science, or was it the science that brought you there?
Well, it's actually kind of how you grow up to be a scientist is kind of a complicated question.
This is true.
I think I was always interested in science. In fact, I started off wanting to be an astronomer. And I spent a lot of time next to actually Long Island Sound, for those of you out there living in Connecticut or Long Island, wandering around the seashore. And so then I had a wonderful biology teacher who got me interested in biology. And then the final thing that happened was after I graduated from college, I wanted to work for a year to sort of figure out exactly what I wanted to do. And I worked for a marine biologist. Actually, she was the first woman to go to the bottom of the deep sea in a submersible. And she's why I became a marine biologist. And then my first or second summer in graduate school, I took a course on coral reefs. And I was just so totally captivated. It was love at first sight. And from then on, I was hooked on coral reefs. So the science came first, but what I chose to do as a scientist is certainly inspired by the extraordinary beauty and complexity of these reefs ecosystems.
Well, we had a number of comments about people commenting on both your scientific depth, of course, when it comes to the research you're doing, but also your passion and appreciation for the subject. Yesterday morning, we are in our first session, we heard Scott Wing talking about evidence talking about the impacts of climate change in prehistoric times. Do we have any evidence about, or is there any, can we learn anything about the future impacts based on past prehistoric research?
Yeah, I'm sure Scott talked quite a bit about past situations which are somewhat analogous to what's happening now. I think the message is that the world will recover if we totally change the chemistry and temperature of the Earth. There are going to be huge impacts, massive extinctions, but we won't wipe out all life on Earth. But one of the other messages that the fossil record tells us is it often takes literally millions of years for the Earth to recover from these major episodes of extinction. So don't be looking for recovery over the short term if we really do something fairly drastic to the chemistry and temperature of the Earth. The consequences will be, we fall off that precipice, we have that broken back camel event, then it's going to take a long time for things to come back. And then the other thing I think it's worth remembering is that people say, oh, it used to be warmer back, say, 65 million years ago, or we had this episode of ocean acidification. But what didn't happen back then was also overfishing, nutrient pollution, invasive species. So the fact that this is part of a whole suite of changes that are happening as a consequence of human activity is also worth remembering. So that's going on top of the climate change, which in itself is also really unprecedented, certainly in terms of recent geological past.
Right. So it's certainly a complex ecosystem, but we do know what the impacts are when all of these forces are at play, and we know what some of the biggest culprits are too.
Yeah, there's really not any ambiguity. Any people, I would say, reef scientists in general, climate scientists. People aren't arguing about who's responsible. I mean, in terms of coral reefs, we know that the major impacts that people have on reefs, and that's why reefs are collapsing now. If you drill a deep hole into a reef, you don't see anything like what's going on now, and for thousands and thousands of years, you see healthy reefs. There's really no precedent for this mass die-off that we're seeing now. So we basically know what's going on. It's not that there's not room for more science. We could find out. We need to know more specific answers to specific questions to design some of the conservation strategies that we need to use. But the bigger issue is just simply making the decision that we care enough to do something about that. We know enough to act right now and actually make a difference. They say over the short term, controlling fishing and water quality is very important, and that buys us time. In the long run, we have to come to grips with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Otherwise, literally, the planet will not be physically suitable for reefs. But we have some time, and if we use some of those local conservation strategies, those are very important for buying time for those corals while we figure out the politically much more complicated question about how to deal with climate change.
Thank you very much. The comments continue to come in, as well as some great additional questions. And what I would encourage people to do is to, first of all, check out the virtual exhibit hall. We have a great number of resources posted from the National Museum of Natural History. Of course, the online ocean portal has some wonderful resources as well. And we do have the discussion forum associated with this session. And as we've suggested, today's live session, or if you're watching it in the future in its recorded format, is meant to be an anchor for continuing dialogue on this. So please do continue the discussions. Right below the area where you logged into this session, there is an area to post comments and to continue that conversation. Nancy Knowlton, thank you so much for taking us underwater and into the future, and hopefully there's some brightness there for.
Yes, I wouldn't do what I do if I didn't believe there was some brightness there, and I look forward to seeing your questions. I'll do my best to answer them, and do log on to the ocean portal. It's just being launched now. It's going to get bigger and better literally every month, and so it's a wonderful source of information as well.
And we will take a roughly 1 hour break. We'll be back with our final 2 sessions of the Smithsonian Education Online Conference. So please do join us in just over an hour. We have 2 really great sessions in store, including one about invention and thinking in innovative ways about solving some of the issues around climate change. In particular, what are some young people doing in this area, and what can we learn from them? And in our final session, we'll be having a closing wrap-up panel that you won't want to miss. And it's a great way to tie up some loose ends for those of you who've been participating in 1 or 2 or 3 or 12 of our sessions. A good way to finish our live experience together. We'll see you in about an hour right here in this room. Thanks, everyone.